I walked into Isabel's engagement party already certain I didn't fit the room. Not because I didn't love my sister, not because I begrudged her joy, but because the space itself made that clear before a single word was spoken. The lighting had been tuned to flatter, the kind that made every face look like it belonged on a magazine cover. Glasses clinked. Laughter rolled easily through the crowd. Confident, rehearsed almost. Everyone looked like they'd practiced for this exact moment. Everyone but me. I was near the entrance when someone closed the distance behind me. A man's voice, quiet and pleased with itself, landed close to my ear. "You really shouldn't have bothered coming. I hadn't even turned to see the smile I already knew was cruel. People like you tend to ruin the pictures." I didn't spin around. I didn't correct him. I stood there, my grip tightening on the small clutch in my hands, something in my chest going eerily calm. No one around us had caught it. No one intervened. The photographer's flash kept firing. The band kept playing. What that man didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that they were standing inside a building I owned outright. He had no idea the woman he'd just insulted held the lease on this venue, and on 3 others just like it. And what I understood, standing there in the quiet after his words, was that saying so now would accomplish nothing. Not yet. I'd learned a long time ago that timing decides everything. I drifted toward the tall windows overlooking the courtyard, letting another cluster of guests pass toward the photo backdrop. From there I could see my parents near the bar, laughing with people they clearly enjoyed more than they'd ever enjoyed my company. Isabel stood at the center of everything, radiant. Exactly where she'd always belonged. The sting of what had just happened didn't hit like something new. It landed like an old ache, familiar down to the bone. That was the part that unsettled me. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even angry. Just tired. The dress I wore hadn't cost much. I'd grabbed it from a department store a few days earlier, after flying home from a work trip. It fit fine. It didn't shimmer. I hadn't touched my hair beyond running a brush through it, hadn't bothered with jewelry that might catch the light. I'd come as exactly who I was. The version of myself that never tried to explain anything, and that version had never once been enough for this family. People moved past without seeing me. A few glanced, eyes dropping and sliding away. An aunt offered a smile that never reached her eyes. A stranger asked who I was waiting for, then lost interest before I finished answering. I leaned against the glass and watched Isabel pose for another round of photos, Grant's arm secure around her waist. The same man who'd leaned in close enough to make sure his insult landed exactly where it would hurt. He laughed now, like someone who'd never once been told no. I wondered how many times in his life he'd sized someone up in a glance and decided they didn't matter. I wondered how often he'd been wrong and never found out. None of it surprised me, really. Not the whisper, not the laughter at my back, not the way no one noticed when I quietly stepped out of frame. This was simply the newest chapter of something that had started long before this party, long before Isabel's engagement, long before I'd learned how to build a life that couldn't be taken from me. I hadn't always known how to hold this kind of stillness. I hadn't always known how to stand quiet while someone tried to make me smaller. That was something I picked up slowly, over years of being measured against someone else and coming up short. Growing up, there had always been one daughter who caught the light, and one who learned to step out of it. My parents weren't unkind people. That was the hardest part to put into words. They showed up. They provided. They loved us the only way they knew how. But love mixed with constant comparison still teaches you exactly where your place is, and mine had always been somewhere near the edge of the frame. Isabel had always been easy to love. She smiled without effort, made friends without trying, could fill any room the second she walked into it. Teachers remembered her name years later. Neighbors asked after her. My parents spoke about her wins like the whole family had earned them. I was the reliable one, the quiet one. The one who was always just fine whenever anyone asked. "She's good," my mother would say. "She keeps to herself." As if that answered everything. At the dinner table, Isabel's stories filled the room. When I spoke, it was usually to answer something I'd already been asked twice. My opinions got a polite, "That's nice," before the conversation moved on to someone else's idea. None of it was cruelty. It was habit. Over time I stopped offering things nobody seemed to want. I learned that asking for less made people comfortable. I learned that if I never reached for attention, no one would resent me for taking it. Standing at that window years later, I could feel the old role settling back over me like it had never left. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne, and I lifted a glass I didn't want, mostly to give my hands something to hold. The bubbles rose fast and bright, then vanished. I watched them go and thought about how strange it was, celebrating something meant to last forever, with a drink that disappeared in seconds. The venue itself really was beautiful. I'd signed off on the final renovation plans 2 years earlier. I'd pushed for the window lighting, insisted on the flooring now catching every shoe under the chandeliers. I knew where every fire exit was. I knew which corners still needed better sound dampening. Nobody here had any idea. They saw a woman standing alone in a plain dress, slightly out of place in a picture she didn't quite match. That suited me fine. A cluster of guests gathered nearby, voices dipping just low enough that they thought I couldn't hear. I had no idea she was even invited, one murmured. I figured this would be a bit more exclusive, another added, and someone chuckled. I didn't look over. I didn't need to. I'd heard that particular sentence, in one form or another, my entire life. For a moment I considered slipping out the way I always used to. Quiet, unnoticed, gone before anyone thought to ask. No one would have stopped me, but I stayed. Not to make a point, and not because I was plotting anything. I stayed because some part of me wanted to see exactly how far people would go once they believed there'd be no cost to it. Across the room, Isabel's eyes found mine for half a second. Something flickered there, guilt maybe, or discomfort, before someone called her name and she turned back toward the crowd, smiling again like nothing had passed between us. I didn't hold it against her. She'd been raised on a different set of rules than I had. I checked my phone more out of reflex than need. A message from my assistant sat unread. A reminder about a morning meeting, about decisions that actually carried weight. I locked the screen and tucked the phone away. Whatever tonight was, it wasn't about that part of my life. Tonight belonged to the version of me this family had shaped long before I'd learned how to outgrow her. I finished the champagne and set the empty glass down. Straightening, I noticed a man near the entrance scanning the room with a kind of quiet precision none of the other guests had. He wasn't dressed for performance. No forced smile, no practiced ease. For a second our eyes met, and there was a flicker of recognition in it, though not the kind that comes from shared history or family obligation. It was the kind that comes from working alongside someone, from rooms where real decisions get made without an audience. I looked away before he could cross the room. Not yet. The music swelled again, pulling everyone's attention back toward the center. Applause rose as someone tapped a glass for a toast. The party rolled forward, eager to celebrate, eager to forget the people standing just outside its edges. I took one last look at the laughter, the whispers, the assumptions people had already made about who I was. They'd always believed a certain version of me. For a long time, I'd let them. That kind of silence wasn't new. Long before any comment about ruined photographs, I'd already lived inside it. Standing by that window, watching everyone laugh without me, didn't shock me. It only confirmed something I'd understood since childhood. In this family, there was always a seat reserved for me, just never one near the head of the table. I'd grown up in what looked, from the outside, like a completely ordinary household. Family dinners, holidays under one roof, parents who worked hard and believed they were doing right by us. Nothing about it looked broken, but there was a pattern running underneath that nobody ever said out loud. Isabel had always drawn people in without trying. Teachers lit up around her, neighbors asked about her, my parents talked about her achievements like the whole family had a stake in them. I was the quieter one, not difficult, just watchful. I'd rather read than work a room, rather plan than improvise. I learned early that the less noise I made, the smoother things went for everyone else. At first, the comparisons were subtle. Your sister's just naturally got that spark, my parents would say, or you know how she is with people. Never said with any real malice, more like they were stating a fact. Over time, those small facts started to feel like instructions. Relatives would ask Isabel about her friends, her plans, her dreams. When they turned to me, it was usually just "how's school going?" followed by a polite nod before the conversation moved on. I learned to keep my answers short. I learned not to interrupt the current. At the table, Isabel's stories filled every silence. When I tried to add something, someone would talk over me, never on purpose, just without noticing. Eventually, I stopped trying. I wasn't invisible, exactly. I was convenient. I did well in school. I followed the rules. If something needed handling quietly and correctly, it landed on me. My parents trusted me completely. But trust and admiration aren't the same thing. Trust meant they didn't worry about me. Admiration meant they didn't think about me much at all. There were moments that should have mattered more than they did. Birthdays marked with a simple card and a practical gift. Achievements met with a quick smile before attention drifted back to whatever Isabel had going on. None of it was dramatic enough to call out. That was the trap of it. Once, in my teenage years, I brought up the idea of leaving for college. Not far, just far enough to feel like my own person for a while. My father nodded and said it might do me some good. My mother added, almost as an afterthought, as long as you're being realistic about it. No one asked what I wanted to study. No one asked why the idea mattered to me at all. The conversation closed itself, as if my future had been given all the consideration it needed. After that, I started keeping more to myself, not out of spite, just instinct. Every time I shared a plan, it came back wrapped in concern instead of curiosity. Every dream I mentioned got quietly reshaped into something smaller, safer. So eventually, I stopped mentioning them. By 17, Isabel and I lived under the same roof but in entirely different worlds. She came home trailing friends and stories and noise. I came home with mental lists, things to finish, ways to stay out of everyone's way. My parents never meant to make me feel like an afterthought. They simply responded to whatever was loudest, easiest to engage with. And I learned early that if I wanted any peace, I had to become the quiet hum in the background of the house. Looking back now, I understand why that whisper at the engagement party hadn't broken me. It slid too easily into a story I'd been handed years before it ever happened. The idea that certain rooms weren't built for me had been planted a long time ago, watered slowly by nothing more dramatic than indifference. There was one particular evening I still return to, small as it was. It was my senior year of high school, and I was at the kitchen table with paperwork spread in front of me. College forms, part-time work schedules, a running list of expenses. I'd been saving quietly for months, picking up weekend and evening shifts, building towards something I didn't even have language for yet. Isabel burst in that night, buzzing about some new opportunity, and my parents lit up instantly, leaning in, asking questions, offering ideas. I waited until the excitement settled before mentioning, almost in passing, that I was thinking about moving out after graduation, finding work somewhere else entirely. My mother studied me like the words had caught her off guard. "That's a big step," she said. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" I told her I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. My father glanced down at the papers scattered in front of me and said there was no need to rush, that I could stay as long as I needed to figure things out. Figure things out, as though I hadn't been doing exactly that, alone, for months already. It landed on me clearly in that moment. They didn't see someone capable of building a new life. They saw someone who needed protecting from the possibility of failing. It wasn't cruelty. It was a kind of limitation dressed up as concern. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to a house that had never quite felt like it belonged to me. And in that stillness, something clarified itself. If I stayed, I would keep being shaped by other people's expectations of who I was supposed to become. If I left, I'd at least get the chance to decide that for myself. I didn't make a scene out of the decision. I didn't ask anyone to understand it. I simply started preparing. Over the following year, I picked up more hours, saved aggressively, researched cities, jobs, apartments, anything that might get me somewhere on my own. When I finally told my parents I was leaving at 19, their reaction was calm. Too calm. My mother asked if I had enough money set aside. My father told me to be careful. Isabel hugged me, already half distracted by something else in her head. Nobody asked what I hoped to become out there. That probably should have hurt more than it did, but by then, I'd already learned that disappointment stings less when you've stopped expecting anything different. Standing at that engagement party years later, watching Isabel glow in a room full of people who adored her, I didn't feel envy. I felt distance, like I was observing a life that had split off from mine a long time before that night. The comment about ruining photographs wasn't really an attack on a stranger. It was an echo, One more reinforcement of the idea that my place was somewhere near the edges, that I should be grateful just to be included, rather than expecting to be respected. I watched my parents laughing easily with guests. I watched Isabel lean into Grant, adored and unbothered. I caught my own reflection faintly in the glass, a woman who had learned how to vanish without ever technically leaving the room. What none of them understood was that my silence had never come from weakness. It came from preparation. I hadn't walked away from my family because I hated them. I left because staying meant I'd keep shrinking, year after year, until there was nothing left of me to notice. And somewhere in the space between being overlooked and being underestimated, I'd figured out how to survive entirely on my own terms. By the time I actually walked out the door at 19, I wasn't running from anything behind me. I was walking straight toward the only future that had ever made sense to me. I left home on a quiet morning, the house still half asleep. There was no big goodbye, no speeches about staying in touch. My suitcase sat by the door, lighter than it probably should have been. A few worn outfits, a couple of books I wasn't ready to let go of. I stood there a moment, listening to the hum of a place I'd outgrown long before I had the words to explain it. My parents were in the kitchen when I came in. My mother was already dressed for work. My father had his phone out, scrolling the news. They both looked up, almost surprised, like they'd forgotten today was actually the day. "So this is really it," my mother said, not unkindly. "Yeah," I told her. "Heading out now." She asked if I had enough money. I said I did. My father reminded me to be careful, to call if I needed anything. The same worn phrases, repeated more out of habit than urgency. Nobody asked if I was scared. Nobody asked what I was hoping to find out there. Isabel came down halfway through, hair a mess, phone already in her hand. She hugged me quickly, told me to text her when I landed, then disappeared back into her mourning. I carried my own suitcase to the car. No one followed me out. No one stood on the porch waving. I hadn't expected them to. I'd already learned that my exits never registered the way Isabel's entrances did. The drive away felt strange, like stepping out of a room where the air had been slowly thinning without me noticing. With every mile, something in my chest loosened. Not happiness exactly, just the sense of finally moving in a direction that was mine. Larkspur Bend wasn't glamorous. It wasn't anyone's dream destination. It was simply cheap enough to afford and far enough to feel anonymous. I found a small room in an old building with thin walls and neighbors I barely saw. The window looked out on an alley. The heat worked when it felt like it. The mattress dipped in the middle. It was perfect. For the first time, nobody there knew who Isabel was. Nobody measured me against her. Nobody expected me to slot into a role I hadn't chosen for myself. Work came fast, mostly because I wasn't picky about it. I waited tables at night, cleaned offices before sunrise, picked up weekend shifts wherever they'd take me. My days blurred into a cycle of work, sleep, and quiet planning. I learned what groceries actually cost when you were buying them yourself. I learned how fast rent came back around. I learned that exhaustion feels different when it's tied to your own survival instead of someone else's expectations of you. There were nights my hands shook, just unlocking the door. Nights I ate standing at the counter because sitting down felt like giving in. Nights I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made an enormous mistake. But underneath the doubt, something steadier was building. The understanding that every choice now was mine alone. If I failed, it would be on my own terms. If I made it, no one else could claim credit. I didn't tell my parents how hard any of it was. When they called, they asked if I was doing okay, and I told them I was fine. It wasn't a lie. Just an incomplete one. I wasn't thriving yet. I was learning. I started saving without any real plan attached to it. A few dollars here, a little more there. I tracked every expense, not out of obsession, but because money had started to mean something new to me. Options. Freedom. I noticed the city differently once I was navigating it alone. I paid attention to which blocks looked worn but structurally sound, which streets felt like they were waiting for something to change. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew I didn't want to spend my whole life paying rent into someone else's future. There was one particular afternoon I still remember clearly. I'd just finished a long shift and was walking home past a row of tired-looking houses when one of them stopped me, a hand-painted for sale sign leaning crooked in the overgrown yard. Most people would have kept walking. I slowed down. I didn't step inside. I didn't call the number written on the sign. I just stood there longer than I meant to, picturing it repaired, cared for, alive again. It wasn't quite a plan yet, it was more of a question. What if I didn't just get by here? What if I actually built something? I pushed the thought away at first. It felt absurd. I was 19, juggling 3 jobs, barely sleeping most nights. Owning anything felt impossibly far off. But the idea followed me home anyway, sitting quietly at the back of my mind while I counted tip money and folded laundry. I didn't mention it to a single soul. Not friends. Definitely not family. I'd already learned that some ideas survive better in silence. My days settled into a rhythm: work, save, watch. I didn't spend on anything that didn't move me forward. I wasn't building a life that looked exciting from the outside, but I was building one that felt solid underneath me. There was loneliness in it, plenty of nights watching people my age go out and live lightly while I counted every dollar. But whenever the doubt crept back in, I reminded myself exactly why I'd left in the first place. Not to be admired, to be free. Nobody in that city knew where I'd sat at family dinners growing up. My landlord didn't compare me to anyone. Responsibility there was blunt and honest, and I appreciated that more than I expected to. I got stronger without noticing it happen. Not loudly, just steadily. I learned to negotiate my own schedule, to say no to things I couldn't afford, to plan in months instead of days. When my parents eventually asked if I planned on moving back, I told them I didn't know. The truth was, I knew exactly what I didn't want. I didn't want to return to a place where my growth would always be measured against someone else's comfort. Leaving hadn't made me brave. It had made me honest. About a year after I moved out, there was a night I sat alone in that small room with a notebook open on my lap, adding up numbers that didn't look like much on their own. Together, though, they told a different story. I wasn't just scraping by anymore, I was laying a foundation. I closed the notebook and looked around at the chipped paint, the second-hand furniture, the alley view below. None of it mattered as much as the fact that I'd gotten here entirely on my own. I thought about my family sometimes, how they probably pictured my life as something temporary, something I'd eventually grow out of. It didn't make me angry. It settled into something closer to resolve. They didn't need to understand what I was doing. They didn't need to approve of it. I wasn't building any of this for them. That night, exhausted but strangely at peace, I understood something that would guide every decision after it. I'd left with nothing but pride, and that had been enough to start with. Everything else would come in time. I didn't start house hunting because I felt ready. I started because I was tired of pouring money into a life that never quite belonged to me. Rent kept climbing. Landlords kept changing the rules without warning. Every month felt like another reminder that nothing around me was permanent. I was walking home from a shift when I noticed it. A crooked little sign in front of a house I'd passed dozens of times without really seeing it. For sale. The letters had faded almost to nothing. The yard was overgrown, the porch sagging slightly to one side. Most people would have called it a problem and kept moving. I stopped. The paint peeled in long strips, revealing older colors underneath. One window was cracked. The front steps groaned under my weight. It looked forgotten. I recognized that feeling. I didn't go inside that day. I didn't call the number. I just stood there longer than made sense, trying to understand why my pulse had picked up. It wasn't excitement, exactly. It was recognition. Underneath the neglect, the bones of the place were solid, straight roofline, foundation that hadn't shifted, at least from what I could tell. Good bones. The phrase stuck with me the whole walk home. It sounded like something people said about potential nobody had bothered to notice yet. Over the following weeks, I found myself taking the long way home just to pass that house again. Sometimes I stopped. Sometimes I just looked. I started noticing other places like it, tucked into blocks that felt like they were on the edge of changing. New coffee shops opening a few streets over. Certain neighborhoods suddenly busier on weekends. I wasn't dreaming anymore. I was studying. When I finally called the number on the sign, my hand wasn't quite steady. The woman on the other end sounded worn down. She told me the house had been sitting on the market a while. Too much work, too many unknowns, according to most buyers. I understood that language. It was the same one people had used about me my entire life. The first time I walked through it, the smell hit me before anything else. Dust, dampness, something old gone stale. The floors were scarred. Water stains marked the walls where something had leaked long ago. The kitchen cabinets hung crooked on rusted hinges. There was no charm here yet, no polish. But I could already picture it. Clean lines where the clutter sat now, light pouring in where grime blocked it. I could imagine standing in a space I'd repaired with my own 2 hands. I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking. Not my parents, not Isabel, not even the handful of people I'd gotten close to in the city. I'd already learned what happened when you shared plans too early. People heard uncertainty and answered it with doubt. Instead, I ran the numbers, over and over, in a notebook full of savings, income, expenses. I looked into loans I barely qualified for. I ran through worst-case scenarios. What if I lost a job? What if repairs cost double what I'd budgeted? What if nobody wanted to rent from someone my age? Every version of the math landed in the same place. It would be hard, but not impossible. When I mentioned it once, casually, to a coworker, she laughed. Not cruelly, just surprised. "You're seriously thinking about buying a house on your own?" I nodded. She shook her head. "That's risky. You're young. Wait until you're more established." The word established felt hollow coming from her. I'd been stable my whole life. Stable enough to carry weight that wasn't mine. Stable enough to be overlooked entirely. I didn't ask anyone for their opinion after that. The day I signed the paperwork, the real estate office was quiet. The agent seemed mildly thrown by me, like she'd expected someone older, someone louder. I didn't fill the room with excitement. I asked careful questions. I read every page twice. When I signed my name, there was no rush of triumph, no dramatic sense of arrival, just a steady awareness that something irreversible had just happened. The house was mine. I moved in immediately, not because it was livable yet, but because I couldn't afford not to. There was no hot water the first week. The heating ran on its own unpredictable schedule. I learned fast which outlets to avoid, which doors stuck shut in humid weather. During the day I worked my regular jobs. At night I became someone else entirely. Watching repair tutorials, muddling through manuals, learning to strip old paint, patch drywall, tell the difference between a cosmetic flaw and a structural one. My hands stayed sore. My clothes smelled permanently of dust and sweat. Some nights I fell asleep too exhausted to think. But something had changed. Every improvement, however small, actually stayed mine. Every hour of work built something that belonged to me, instead of disappearing into someone else's asset. I fixed the worst leaks first, then moved on to the floors. I painted one room at a time, careful not to rush the process. I found fixtures secondhand at salvage yards, learning to see value where other people only saw junk. Slowly, the house started to change. So did I. There were nights I questioned everything, standing under a shower that barely ran warm, wondering if I'd made a mistake. Lying awake listening to unfamiliar creaks, wondering if I'd taken on more than I could actually manage. But every time the doubt surfaced, I reminded myself of one simple fact. Nobody had pushed me into this. Nobody had talked me into it. This wasn't a life I'd stumbled into. It was one I was building, board by board. When my parents asked how things were going, I told them I was busy. When Isabel asked where I was living, I said I'd found a place. Neither of them pushed for details, and I didn't offer any. I wasn't hiding, I was protecting something still too fragile to survive their opinions. After several months, the changes became visible enough that neighbors started noticing. Someone commented on the fresh paint. Another asked if I was planning to sell. I shook my head. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The idea of renting out a room came slowly, almost as an afterthought at first. A way to offset the bills. To breathe a little easier. I researched leases and tenant laws. I didn't rush any of it. When I finally listed a room, my hands didn't shake the way they used to. I'd learned the value of patience. The first person who moved in was quiet, respectful, on time with rent. For the first time since I'd left home, I felt something shift. The house wasn't just shelter anymore. It was working alongside me. I kept my lifestyle exactly the same. No celebrations, no upgrades. Every spare dollar went straight back into repairs or savings. I tracked everything. I treated the whole thing less like a dream and more like a system. Some evenings, after finishing work, I'd sit on the front steps and look at what I'd built so far. It wasn't impressive by most standards. It wasn't something you'd brag about at a dinner party. But it was solid, real. I thought about the girl who'd walked out at 19 with a suitcase and not much else, about how little faith anyone had placed in her back then. I didn't feel bitter about it anymore. I felt grateful, honestly. Being underestimated had given me room to move without anyone looking over my shoulder. The day the first rent payment actually cleared, I remember refreshing my banking app twice just to make sure it was real. The number wasn't life-changing on its own, but it meant something. The house had stopped being just shelter. It was working. My tenant and I crossed paths occasionally in the kitchen, traded polite hellos, went back to our separate lives. I learned quickly that being a landlord wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. When something broke, I fixed it. When there was confusion, I clarified it. I wasn't collecting money for nothing. I was maintaining a system, and that word stuck with me. System. I didn't change my spending. I didn't tell anyone. I opened a separate account and funneled every dollar of rental income into it, treating it almost like it didn't exist. Instead, I started writing everything down. Expenses, repair timelines, what mattered to tenants and what didn't. I learned that fresh paint counted for more than trendy fixtures, that clean and functional beat flashy every time. I wasn't following advice from some guru or book. I was learning straight from reality. The house taught me patience. It taught me that small decisions compound, that every problem solved makes the next one feel less impossible. Something else started loosening too, an anxiety I'd carried for years without quite naming it. It didn't vanish, but it softened. There was comfort in knowing that if I lost a job, I wouldn't lose everything. That one property had given me a margin I'd never had before. I didn't feel wealthy. I felt secure, and that changed the way I carried myself through the world. I stood a little straighter. I spoke a little more deliberately, not to impress anyone, just because I trusted myself more each day. A few months later, I started noticing other properties, not obsessively, just with more intention. I paid attention to listings that sat untouched too long, priced just low enough to scare most buyers off. I recognized the pattern by now. Too much work, too many unknowns, too risky. I didn't rush to buy anything. I just watched. I took different routes on my commute, noticing which blocks were quietly shifting, which streets were suddenly busier on weekends. I read up on zoning, on permit timelines, on how long people were usually willing to wait before giving up on a place. I wasn't dreaming about scale. I was learning context. My family still knew nothing about any of it. When my parents called, they asked about work, and I told them things were steady. When Isabel mentioned her plans, I listened. Nobody asked how I was actually living, whether I needed anything. That silence used to sting. Now it felt like freedom. Their disinterest meant they couldn't interfere, couldn't second-guess choices shaped by assumptions that no longer applied to me. The second house came into my life just as quietly. No adrenaline rush, no dramatic moment. Just another listing that had sat too long, smaller than the first, rougher around the edges, but the numbers worked, barely. I walked through it once, then again, evaluating rather than falling for it this time. I knew exactly what I was looking at, which problems were manageable, which were deal breakers, what I could fix myself, and what I'd need help with. When I made the offer, my hands were steady. No spiraling, no doubt. Just quiet confidence built on experience. I visited home once during that stretch. A short trip. The house looked the same. The conversations followed the same old grooves. Isabel talked about her life. My parents listened. When it was my turn, the questions were brief. Work still good? Yeah, I said. Busy. They nodded, satisfied, no follow-up. I realized then that I could be living an entirely different life, and it wouldn't disturb the version of me they carried around in their heads. That realization was strangely calming. Back home, standing between my two properties one evening, with the keys still in my hand, the sky darkening above me, there was no one there to witness it. No one to congratulate me. I didn't need them to. What I felt wasn't pride exactly. It was alignment. For the first time, the effort I was pouring into my life actually matched the direction it was heading. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, while I stood in the hallway of my second property holding a clipboard, half listening to a contractor explain why a repair was going to take longer than promised. I stepped into an empty room to answer, already bracing for the familiar tone. "Meredith," my mother said, warm but distant, "I wanted to make sure you got the invitation." I glanced at an email notification I hadn't opened yet. I already knew what it was before she said another word. Isabel's engagement. The date, the venue, a family milestone I was expected to show up for simply because that's what daughters did. "Yes," I said. "I saw it. We're so excited," she continued. "It's going to be a lovely evening. Really nice venue. You'll like it." I thanked her and let the silence fill while she rattled on about catering and guest counts, waiting for the part that never came. She never asked how I was. Never asked if I could actually make it work with my schedule. The invitation wasn't a question. It was a notice. After we hung up, I stood alone and let the weight of it settle. I hadn't been back in a while, long enough that my life there no longer felt tethered to that place in any real sense. The thought of returning brought a familiar heaviness, not quite fear, more like fatigue. I had plenty of reasons to decline. Work was full. Travel was inconvenient. Emotionally, reopening old patterns felt unnecessary. I stared at the wall, imagining the relief of just staying where I was. But I said yes. Not out of obligation, and not because I wanted anyone's approval. I said yes because part of me wanted to see what it would feel like to walk back into that world as someone they no longer understood. The drive home took longer than I remembered. Familiar exits blurred past, each one tugging at a memory I didn't linger on. I wasn't returning as the girl who'd left with a suitcase and quiet resolve. I was returning as someone else entirely, even if nobody there knew it yet. I arrived the night before the party. My parents' house looked exactly as I'd left it. Same paint, same porch light, same sense that time moved differently inside those walls. My mother hugged me tightly, commenting on how thin I looked. My father asked about the drive. Isabel was out handling last-minute details. Dinner was polite, comfortable, predictable. They asked about my job the same vague way they always had. "Still busy with the property stuff?" my father asked. "Yes," I said. "Still busy." "That's good," my mother said. "Stability's important." Nobody asked what that stability actually looked like, what I managed, what I'd built. The conversation drifted easily back to wedding plans, to Grant's family, to how exciting everything was. I smiled and listened, feeling strangely detached, like watching a play from a seat too far back for the dialogue to really reach me. Alone in my old bedroom that night, I unpacked slowly. The room felt smaller than I remembered, still holding traces of a version of me that felt distant now. I sat on the edge of the bed and took a breath. This place had shaped me. It no longer defined me. The morning of the party arrived bright and clear. I woke early, not from excitement but habit, and dressed simply, comfort over impact. I wasn't there to be noticed. I wasn't there to explain myself. I was there to observe. At breakfast, Isabel swept in energized and scattered, hugging me quickly, thanking me for coming, already rattling off a list of last-minute tasks. I congratulated her, genuinely. She looked happy. That mattered. Grant arrived shortly after. Confident, well-spoken, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. He shook my hand firmly, asked what I did for work, and nodded politely at my answer, a flicker of something crossing his face when I didn't elaborate further. Curiosity, maybe. Or judgment. Either way, he moved on quickly. The venue was a short drive away. When we pulled in, I recognized it instantly. The angle of the building, the landscaping choices, the way the afternoon light hit the entrance just right. I'd approved those details myself. My parents admired the place openly, commenting on how elegant it felt. Isabel gushed about the photo opportunities. Grant talked about how impressed his family had been. I said nothing. Walking through the space felt surreal. I knew which floorboards creaked, which corners had given us the most trouble during renovation. I moved through it like a guest. Even though every detail whispered familiarity, nobody noticed. Guests started arriving, filling the room with noise and expectation. I stood slightly apart, watching it all unfold. Relatives I hadn't seen in years greeted me politely, then drifted off. Conversations moved around me. rarely landing. It didn't offend me. If anything, it confirmed something. Isabel moved through the crowd effortlessly, introducing people, posing for photos, laughing exactly the way everyone had always adored. I was genuinely happy for her. I just understood my role hadn't changed. As the room grew louder, I found myself drawn back toward the windows. The same instinct as always. It was easier to breathe on the edges, easier to see everything from there. Fragments of conversation drifted past, comments about appearances, about success, about who belonged where. None of it aimed at me directly. Not yet. My parents waved at me from across the room, smiling, proud. I waved back. We shared a moment of pure politeness and nothing more. I thought about how many times in my life I'd tried to close that distance, to make myself more visible, and how exhausting all of it had been. Standing now in a room I owned but didn't claim, surrounded by people who didn't see me, I felt strangely calm. I had nothing left to prove here. The evening rolled forward exactly as planned. Toasts, rising laughter, cameras flashing. Nobody asked me anything new. I watched Isabel lean into Grant, watched him hold court with ease, watched the way his eyes swept the room, assessing people quickly and confidently. I wondered what conclusions he'd already drawn. The thought didn't upset me, it intrigued me. Something was about to shift. Not because I planned it, not because I wanted it, but because truth has a way of surfacing the moment people get too busy performing to notice it arriving. I stepped fully into the room just as the music shifted, the crowd drawing closer together near the center, where Isabel and Grant posed for another round of photos. The air felt warmer now, thick with perfume, champagne, and expectation. This was the part of the night everyone would remember, when first impressions hardened into lasting ones. Nobody was looking for me. I stood near the edge, smoothing my dress once out of habit, then stopped myself. Plain fabric, nothing remarkable. It did exactly what it needed to. So did I. A cluster of relatives passed behind me. Voices dropped just low enough that they assumed discretion. Didn't expect her to actually show, one murmured. Well, she is family, I suppose. Another laughed softly. The word family landed oddly, more like a technicality than anything resembling a bond. I didn't turn around. I'd learned long ago that confronting a whisper only gave it more weight. Instead, I watched the reflection in the glass as people rearranged themselves toward better lighting, better company. A woman I barely recognized smiled politely and asked if I was visiting for long. Just a few days, I said. She nodded, already glancing past me. That's nice. The conversation ended before it began. Isabel laughed loudly near the center of the room, head tilted just right as the cameras caught her. She looked radiant, completely at ease. Grant stood beside her, relaxed, soaking up the attention, looking like someone who'd never once questioned whether he belonged. I wondered when exactly he'd decided I didn't. As if summoned by the thought, he broke away from the photo cluster and started weaving through the crowd, eyes scanning faces, assessing, categorizing. When they landed on me, they paused half a second too long. He smiled, polite on the surface, practiced, and closed the distance between us. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked. "Yes," I told him, and it wasn't a lie. Watching counted as enjoyment, for me. His gaze flicked briefly to my dress and back to my face, quick but not exactly subtle. I'd seen that particular calculation dressed up as curiosity before. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping to something casual, confident, the tone of someone who assumes agreement before they've even finished speaking. "You know," he said, "you really shouldn't have bothered coming." I felt the shift before the words fully registered. The noise of the room seemed to dull just slightly around us. I didn't respond. He smiled wider, mistaking my silence for confusion, and leaned closer still, close enough that I caught the deliberate, expensive scent of his cologne. "People like you tend to ruin the photos," he whispered, almost playful, like he was letting me in on some harmless secret. For a second I thought I might have misheard him, not because the words were unclear, but because they were so casually cruel that some part of me resisted accepting them. But I'd heard him. My fingers curled slightly at my side, nails pressing into my palm. My chest went very still. Not tight. Just quiet, like everything inside me had paused to take note. He pulled back, satisfied, already glancing past me toward someone more interesting. For him, the exchange was over. Around us, laughter continued, glasses clinked, someone called out for another photo. Nobody had noticed. The moment existed only between the two of us, sealed by his certainty that it would stay that way. I watched his back as he rejoined Isabel, slipping an arm around her, whispering something that made her laugh. She leaned into him, unaware. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I didn't feel the urge to make a scene. What I felt was colder than that, and far more familiar. Recognition. This wasn't about photographs. It wasn't even really about money. It was about permission. He'd decided, in a single glance, that I didn't deserve space in his picture, and he'd felt entitled enough to say so out loud. I stepped away before anyone could see my expression change, letting the crowd close behind me. Near the windows, the air felt cooler. I rested my hand against the glass and focused on my breathing, slow and even. Outside, the courtyard lights glowed, indifferent to whatever had just happened inside. I thought about how many times I'd been reduced to an inconvenience, something to manage rather than respect. I thought about how easily people reveal themselves once they believe there won't be any consequences. I didn't leave. That was the part I was proudest of afterward. I stayed because I refused to let someone else decide where I belonged. I stayed because walking out immediately would have felt like proving him right. Small shifts followed, conversations pausing when I got close, glances thrown my way then quickly averted. One of my aunts brushed past and offered a thin smile. "Brave of you, coming alone," she said, like it was a compliment. I nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "Not everyone's comfortable in a place like this." I let the implication sit between us. "Comfort grows with time," I said. She didn't know what to do with that, and excused herself quickly. My parents caught my eye from across the room again, my mother lifting her glass in a small gesture, smiling. I smiled back, the distance between us feeling larger than the room itself. I watched Isabel move through the crowd, still radiant, still busy, and held on to the fact that none of this was her fault. She'd grown up in a world built to reward her presence. She didn't know what it felt like to be quietly erased. Footsteps approached behind me, slower, more deliberate than the rest of the crowd's movement. I didn't need to turn around to recognize the rhythm of them. When I finally looked, I saw a man a few feet away, his expression shifting from surprise into recognition, his posture straightening with something that looked almost like respect. "Meredith," he said carefully, testing the name. I met his gaze and gave a small nod. For a second, the room around us seemed to hold its breath. The laughter farther away, the music dulled. He smiled, genuine this time, and stepped closer. I didn't know it yet, but whatever cruelty had just been whispered behind my back had already reached its expiration date. Not because I'd planned revenge. Not because I'd raised my voice, but because someone else had just seen me clearly, and once that happens, the laughter never quite sounds the same again. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in pieces, a laugh cutting short near the bar, a conversation trailing off mid-sentence. The music kept playing, just softer somehow, like it sensed it wasn't the main thing people were listening to anymore. Desmond stepped closer, careful not to intrude but clearly intent on speaking. He wore nothing that announced wealth, no need to advertise it. His confidence came from familiarity, from knowing he belonged wherever real decisions got made. "I thought that was you," he said, warm with recognition. "It's been a while." "It has," I answered. He nodded, catching up on time we hadn't spoken aloud in. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." Before I could respond, he extended his hand slightly outward, not quite toward me, an unconscious signal that our conversation wasn't private anymore. "Glad I caught you," he said. "I wanted to talk about the Brackwater expansion. We finalized the numbers. I think you'll be pleased." The words hung there, strange and out of place among talk of hors d'oeuvres and wedding colors. A woman nearby froze mid-sip. Someone else tilted their head, listening now. "We can talk tomorrow," I said calmly. "Tonight isn't the setting for it." He chuckled. "Of course. Always practical." The way he said it carried history, respect that had been earned, not assumed. Behind him I saw movement. Grant had turned toward us, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to something sharper. He stepped closer, clearly trying to place this man, who'd suddenly pulled the room's attention without asking for it. "Didn't realize you were coming tonight," Desmond continued easily. "When I saw the guest list, your name wasn't on it. Then again, you've never needed a formal invitation." That line landed harder than anything he'd said before it. Someone whispered, "Who is that?" Just loud enough to carry. Desmond followed my gaze, noticing the small circle forming around us, his brow furrowing slightly. "Oh," he said, glancing between me and the crowd. "I suppose I should introduce you properly." I didn't stop him. I didn't encourage him either. I just stood there. "This is Meredith," he said. "She owns this property, along with several others you'd probably recognize if you've followed the hospitality scene the last decade. She's been leading the redevelopment work personally." The sentence moved through the room like a slow wave. First disbelief, a few nervous laughs quickly swallowed. Then the realization spread, uneven and awkward, as people replayed the last hour in their heads. Cameras lowered, glasses hovered, forgotten, in hands that didn't know where to rest anymore. Grant went pale. He stared at me openly now, all his earlier ease draining out of him as recognition set in. I could almost watch the memory of his whisper replaying behind his eyes, reshaping itself with sudden, brutal clarity. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Isabel stood frozen beside him, her smile faltering. "What?" she asked quietly, barely audible over the sudden hush. Desmond seemed to register the tension he'd just triggered. "Yes," he said, gently but firmly. "Meredith owns the venue. She also owns the management company running it. She's been leading these redevelopment projects herself." "I had no idea," someone murmured near the back. "She doesn't look like—" The sentence died, unfinished. I felt eyes on me from every direction now, no longer curious but calculating. People scrambling to rebuild their understanding of the room they'd been standing in all night. My parents stood rigid near the bar. My mother's knuckles had gone white around her glass. My father looked like he was trying to reconcile two versions of me that refused to line up. Grant took a hesitant step toward me. "Meredith," he said, voice strained. "I didn't realize. We didn't know you were—" I met his gaze calmly. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just let the silence stretch until it turned uncomfortable. "You didn't ask," I said. "It wasn't an accusation, just a fact." Desmond cleared his throat softly. "I'll let you catch up," he said, offering a small respectful nod. "We'll talk soon." "Of course," I replied, and as he walked away, the space he left behind felt larger, more exposed. The room seemed to fully register, all at once, what had just happened. Conversations resumed, but lower now, more careful. People avoided my eyes, or stared too long, unsure which reaction was safer. A woman who'd ignored me earlier approached, smiling too brightly. "Meredith, right? I had no idea you were the owner. This place is stunning. Thank you," I said. She waited for more, some kind of praise or gratitude to ease her own discomfort. Nothing came. She drifted off, unsettled. My parents finally crossed the room, steps hesitant. "Meredith," my mother said softly. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her for a long moment, really looked. "You never asked," I said, gently but firmly, again. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. Whatever he'd planned to say didn't survive contact with the truth. Isabel stood a few feet off, eyes glossy, hands twisting together. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear I didn't." "I know," I told her, and I meant it. Grant hovered nearby, visibly uncomfortable, his earlier swagger completely gone. He didn't try to speak to me again. Around us, the engagement party continued in name only. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of embarrassment and restraint. Nobody seemed sure which version of me applied anymore. The quiet sister, the invisible guest, or the woman who owned the building beneath their feet. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't clarify. A few minutes later, I slipped out toward the side corridor. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed. In the quieter hallway, I leaned against the wall, not from weakness, but release. The truth had surfaced entirely on its own terms, without any push from me, exactly as it should have. I hadn't planned to reveal anything that night. I hadn't rehearsed a single line. But standing there, I understood something clearly. Revelations don't feel triumphant when they finally happen. They feel strangely empty, like watching people scramble to catch up to a version of you that had existed for years without their notice. I straightened, adjusted my dress, and took a breath. When I walked back into the main room, people noticed. They couldn't help it now. But their attention felt hollow, late. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered either. They simply didn't know how to look at me, and in that uncertainty, I felt something unexpected. Freedom. Because once people see the truth, even imperfectly, they lose the power to define you. And that, I'd learned, was the quietest kind of victory there was. The quiet that followed didn't feel dramatic. It felt heavy and awkward, like someone had switched the lights on too fast, and everyone needed a second to adjust. People didn't rush toward me, and they didn't rush away either. They hovered in that uncomfortable in-between, suddenly very interested in their drinks, their phones, the table settings. Conversations picked back up, but carefully now, like everyone was scared of saying the wrong thing. I stood near the same spot I'd occupied all evening, except the air around me had changed completely. Before, I'd been invisible. Now I was impossible to ignore. A couple I didn't recognize whispered to each other, glancing my way, one of them nodding slowly like a puzzle piece had just clicked into place. Someone else laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny, trying to drag the mood back to where it had been an hour ago. It didn't work. The easy joy had drained out of the room, replaced by an attention nobody quite knew what to do with. Smiles stayed on faces, but they'd gone stiff, rehearsed. The party kept going because it had to, not because anyone still felt like celebrating. I found my parents standing together near the bar. My mother kept smoothing the front of her jacket, a nervous habit I only ever saw when something had really thrown her. My father stared into his glass without drinking, like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the floor. Neither of them had come over yet. I wasn't surprised. Across the room, Grant stood rigid beside Isabel, all his earlier ease gone. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set. When someone spoke to him, his laugh came out wrong, forced. Every few seconds his eyes flicked toward me, then quickly away, like he was afraid of what might happen if we actually made eye contact. I didn't look back. I felt no need to confront him. The damage from his own words had already landed, not on me, but on the image he'd worked so hard to maintain. Now that the balance in the room had flipped, he clearly had no idea how to stand inside it. That was his problem to sit with. A woman approached me hesitantly, holding a half-empty glass of champagne, smiling too wide. "Meredith?" she said, testing the name. "I just wanted to say, this place is incredible. You must be so proud." "Thank you," I said. She lingered, waiting for something more. Validation, maybe. Some kind of permission to feel better about herself. When it didn't come, her smile faltered. "Well," she said quickly, "congratulations to your sister. It's a beautiful night." "Yes," I agreed, "it is." She walked off, clearly unsettled. I watched her go, not with satisfaction, just quiet curiosity. This was what happened when people realized too late they'd misjudged someone. They scrambled to correct the record without ever addressing the mistake itself. Two relatives who'd barely acknowledged me earlier suddenly found reasons to stand closer. One complimented my dress, another asked how long I'd been in property. The questions felt rushed, transactional, like gathering information might restore some kind of balance. I answered politely, briefly. I didn't expand. Respect born out of sudden fear had never interested me. Isabel finally made her way over as the music dipped into something softer. Her face was pale, her expression tight with feelings she clearly hadn't sorted through yet. "Meredith," she said quietly, "can we talk?" I nodded and followed her a few steps away from the crowd, back toward the same windows I'd been standing at all night. "I didn't know," she said immediately, the words tumbling out. "About the venue. About any of it. I swear." "I know," I told her. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" she asked. I studied her face, really studied it. There was no malice there, just confusion and something close to shame. "There was never a moment it felt like anyone wanted to know," I said gently. She flinched, like the truth had landed closer than she'd braced for. "That's not fair," she said softly. "I'm not blaming you," I replied. "I'm just explaining." She glanced toward the center of the room, where Grant stood talking to someone, posture still stiff. He didn't know either, she said, almost defensively. About you, I mean. I met her eyes again. That's not what matters, I said. What matters is how he chose to speak to me when he thought it wouldn't cost him anything. Her eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? I hesitated. Not from fear, but because I didn't want to shift my pain onto her happiness on a night already heavy enough. He said something inappropriate, I said finally. Earlier. Her face drained of color. What did he say? I shook my head. That's between me and him. She searched my face. Realization dawning slowly. Is that why everything feels like this now? Yes, I said. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, fighting tears. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I never meant for you to feel. I know, I said again, and I meant it. She hadn't meant to hurt me. But intention had never erased impact. It never had. We stood there in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party drifting around us like something distant and unreal. Finally, she reached out and squeezed my hand. I hope you'll stay, she said quietly. At least a little while longer. I considered it, then shook my head. I think I'm going to head out soon. Disappointment flickered across her face, but she nodded. Okay. When I turned back toward the room, my parents were finally crossing over. Meredith, my mother said, her voice unsteady. Why didn't you tell us? The question hung there, familiar and loaded. I exhaled slowly. You never asked, I said. Not once. My father frowned, clearly struggling. That's not true. We asked how work was going. Yes, I said. And I answered. My mother's eyes filled. We would have been so proud of you, she said. The words landed strangely. Too late, too conditional. I didn't need pride, I told her. I needed curiosity. Neither of them spoke after that. We stood there, surrounded by a room full of people who suddenly didn't know what to say to any of us. The distance that had always existed between me and my family was finally visible to everyone else, and it was uncomfortable for all of us. After a few more minutes, I excused myself. No announcement, no goodbye tour. I slipped away the same way I always had. Outside, the night air was cool and grounding. I took a deep breath and felt my shoulders drop for the first time all evening. The building behind me glowed warmly, still beautiful, still functional, still mine. I walked to my car without looking back. Later that night, alone, I replayed the evening in my mind. Not the whisper, not the reveal, but the look on people's faces afterward. The confusion, the scrambling, the quiet shame. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Being seen like that, suddenly and incompletely, had left me feeling more exposed than I'd expected. I'd lived comfortably in anonymity for years. Stepping out of it, even without meaning to, came with a cost. My phone kept buzzing with messages I didn't answer. Apologies, questions, awkward attempts at reconnecting. I let them sit. What struck me most wasn't the cruelty of what had been said to me. It was how fast people changed once they realized they'd misjudged someone. How quickly respect followed money, status, ownership. It confirmed something I'd suspected for a long time. Most people don't regret their behavior. They regret being wrong about who you were. I fell asleep that night with the window cracked, listening to the distant hum of the city, my mind clearer than it had been in days. They'd finally seen me. But somehow, being seen like that felt lonelier than being ignored ever had. As sleep pulled me under, I knew one thing for certain. The hardest part wasn't over. Now that the truth was out, I'd have to decide what came next. Morning arrived quietly, without the weight of the night before. I woke before my alarm, the room still dim, my thoughts already clear in a way they hadn't been in years. No rush of anger, no replaying of words, just a steady awareness that something fundamental had shifted. My phone sat on the nightstand, dark but heavy with everything waiting on it. I didn't reach for it right away. I sat up, feet on the floor, and let the silence settle. For the first time since the party, the noise of everyone else's reactions felt distant, manageable. When I finally checked it, the messages were exactly what I'd expected. Missed calls, texts that opened with apologies and ended in uncertainty. Isabel had called twice. My mother had left a voicemail. Even a few relatives I hadn't spoken to in years had somehow found my number. I answered none of them. Instead, I showered, dressed, made coffee like it was any other morning. The ritual grounded me. It reminded me my life hadn't actually been disrupted, only their perception of it had. The first call I did answer came mid-morning. Isabel's name lit up the screen. I hesitated, then picked up. "Meredith," she said immediately, voice tight. "I'm so sorry about last night. I didn't sleep at all." "I know," I said calmly. There was a pause, then a rush of words. "I should have noticed. I should have asked more questions. I never imagined." "I know," I said again. She took a breath. "Can we talk? Really talk?" I looked out the window at the street below. People moving through their mornings, unaware anything had changed for me. "Not today," I said gently. Her silence stretched. "Are you upset with me?" "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm just being careful." "Careful about what?" "About what I let back in," I replied. She didn't argue. That surprised me. "Okay," she said quietly. "When you're ready." After we hung up, I felt lighter. Not because the conversation had resolved anything, but because I hadn't bent. I hadn't rushed to reassure her at the expense of my own clarity. The next call came from my mother. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Meredith," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Your father and I have been talking. We had no idea." "I know," I said. "We would have supported you," she insisted, "if we'd known." I closed my eyes briefly. "That's the thing," I said. "You didn't know because you never asked." She inhaled sharply, like the truth had caught her off guard. "We thought we were giving you space." "Space isn't the same as interest," I said. She went quiet for a long moment. "Can we come see you?" she asked. "We'd like to understand." I considered it carefully. "Not right now," I said. Her voice wavered. "Why?" "Because understanding can't start with guilt," I replied. "And that's where you are right now." She didn't deny it. After the call ended, I sat with the feeling that followed. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't bitterness either. It was something steadier. The sense of finally choosing myself without needing to explain why. Throughout the day, the pattern repeated. Messages asking to meet, calls offering apologies, layered with justifications. Each one slightly different, but the core the same. They wanted access. They wanted reassurance that the old balance hadn't shifted too far. I didn't give it to them. That afternoon I went into work. The normalcy of it felt intentional, grounding. Staff greeted me the way they always did. Meetings ran the way they always ran. Decisions made efficiently, without emotion attached. Nobody there treated me any differently. Nobody tiptoed. I realized how rare, and how valuable that actually was. During a break, my assistant asked if everything was okay. She'd noticed the calls. "Yes," I said, and this time it felt completely true. Late in the day, Grant tried reaching me. I recognized the number and let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. I imagined him pacing, rehearsing an apology built more around his own discomfort than around what he'd actually said. I wasn't interested. That evening, my parents sent a message together, asking for dinner, neutral ground, a chance to talk things through. They used words like family and healing and moving forward. I read it once, then set the phone down. I understood exactly what they wanted, to reset, to smooth over the discomfort, to return to something familiar where the roles were clear and nobody had to be challenged. I wasn't going back there. I typed a short reply. "Not today. I need some time. I'll reach out when I'm ready." No argument followed. Just silence. And in that silence, something clicked into place. I realized how often, in the past, I'd rushed to close gaps other people were perfectly comfortable leaving open. How often I'd been the one softening every edge, smoothing things over for everyone else's benefit. Setting a boundary felt uncomfortable, not because it was wrong, but because it was new. The discomfort didn't mean I was being cruel. It meant I was finally being honest. That night I took a walk through my neighborhood. The air was cool, the streets familiar. I passed buildings I owned, spaces I'd poured years into without any fanfare. Nobody here knew about the engagement party. Nobody here cared. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I thought about everything I could do now, if I wanted to. the leverage I held without ever having to claim it. I could complicate contracts. I could make certain careers a lot harder. I could make people feel small the way they'd tried to make me feel. I didn't want to. Revenge required staying emotionally tied to their approval, their regret, their fear. I'd already spent too much of my life doing exactly that. What I wanted instead was distance, clarity, a life that didn't require constant explanation. Back home, I poured a glass of water and sat at the table, running through my calendar for the coming week. Meetings, site visits, ordinary things. The future ahead of me looked steady, untouched by the drama I'd just walked through. My phone buzzed again. A message from Isabel. Just 3 words. I understand now. I stared at it a moment, then set the phone face down. Understanding didn't require immediate forgiveness. Growth didn't require my participation. As the night settled in, something clicked fully into place. The respect being offered to me now had arrived too late to mean much. It wasn't rooted in actually knowing me, it was rooted in realizing they'd underestimated me. That wasn't the kind of respect I wanted. What I wanted was to protect the life I'd built, to keep it from being reshaped by people who'd only just noticed it existed. Before bed, I wrote 1 line in my notebook, something I knew I'd return to again and again. Boundaries aren't punishments, they're instructions. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, calm and resolved. Tomorrow would bring more conversations, more attempts at repair. I'd face them on my own timeline. For now, it was enough to know I no longer had to prove anything. The moment they finally saw me clearly was the same moment I stopped needing their validation. Respect that only shows up after the reveal isn't a gift. It's a reminder of exactly why the boundary matters. I didn't wake up angry the next morning. That surprised me more than almost anything else. For years I'd carried a low-grade resentment, something that flared every time I thought about my family or the way I'd been treated. I expected it to come roaring back after the party. Instead, there was only clarity. And clarity can be unsettling when you're used to noise. In the days that followed, I became sharply aware of how much power I actually held. Not the loud kind people brag about, but the quiet kind that comes from position, timing, and choice. I saw it in how carefully emails were suddenly worded, how quickly calls got returned, how people who'd never bothered learning anything real about me now spoke as if they'd always been in my corner. It was tempting to test that power. I could have made a few calls and made Grant's professional life considerably harder. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just enough pressure applied in the right places to remind him that words carry weight. I knew exactly how his industry's partnerships worked. I knew which reputations were fragile. The thought crossed my mind more than once. I imagined him realizing, too late, how close he'd come to real consequences over one whispered sentence. But when I followed that thought all the way through, it didn't bring satisfaction. It brought exhaustion. I didn't want to spend my energy engineering someone else's downfall. I'd spent too many years building myself up to start measuring my worth by how effectively I could tear someone else down. That realization felt like its own kind of victory. I heard things secondhand, of course. News travels fast once people get uncomfortable. Isabel called once to mention Grant had been on edge, worried about work, asking her repeatedly if she thought I was angry enough to interfere. I listened without reacting. "He's scared," she said quietly, almost apologetically. "I know," I replied. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. There was a long pause. "Nothing," she repeated, like the word didn't compute. Most people don't understand that. We're taught that power means action, that control means response, that choosing stillness looks like weakness. But sometimes it's the opposite. The longer he sat in his own uncertainty, not knowing where he stood or what I was capable of, the more he had to face his own behavior without any distraction. That reckoning was his to have, not mine to deliver. My parents were struggling in a different way, not fear but shame. They'd started replaying years of old conversations, searching for the moment they'd missed something important. My mother left a voicemail one evening, her voice trembling slightly, talking about how proud she was of me now, how amazed she was by everything I'd built, how she wished she'd known sooner. I listened to it once, then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, out of honesty. Pride that only shows up after proof isn't the kind that heals old wounds. It doesn't erase years of being overlooked. It doesn't magically turn absence into presence. What my parents were feeling wasn't really pride. It was regret. And regret, however understandable, isn't a foundation you can rebuild trust on. They wanted reassurance that things could go back to normal now that they finally saw me clearly. They never said it outright, but I heard it in the way they talked about moving forward, without ever really addressing what had come before. I wasn't interested in that version of peace. For the first time, I let myself sit with the idea that I didn't owe anyone closure, that I didn't have to make things comfortable for people who'd been perfectly comfortable while I struggled. That was harder than any confrontation could have been. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my own feelings just to keep the peace. All the times silence had felt easier than being misunderstood. Back then, silence had been survival. Now it was a choice. I threw myself back into work that week. Site visits, budget reviews, long-term planning, all the things that had always grounded me. My team didn't tiptoe around me. They didn't ask questions. They treated me exactly the way they always had, and I realized how rare that actually was. My value there had never depended on comparison or assumption. It had been built through consistency, and that consistency was what I trusted. One afternoon, my assistant mentioned casually that someone had called asking to speak with me directly. When I asked who, she hesitated. "It was your brother-in-law," she said, "or soon-to-be." I nodded. "Did you tell him I wasn't available?" "Yes." "That's fine," I said, and it was. I didn't need to hear his apology. I didn't need to watch him try to justify himself. Whatever he wanted to say would be about easing his own discomfort, not acknowledging the harm he'd caused. Sometimes the most meaningful consequence is simply being denied an audience. As the days passed, the urgency in everyone's reactions began to fade. Fear softened into caution. Shame dulled into something more manageable. And I felt myself loosening too. I slept better. I focused more easily. All the mental energy I used to spend anticipating judgment or defending my choices was suddenly free. I hadn't realized how much of my life had been quietly shaped by the expectation of being underestimated. Without that weight, everything felt lighter. One evening, sitting alone in my living room, I found myself thinking about revenge, and how badly most people misunderstand it. People imagine it as an explosion, a public reckoning, some dramatic reversal of roles. But the kind that actually lasts is quieter than that. It's refusing to get pulled back into dynamics that shrink you. It's not explaining yourself to people who never bothered listening the first time. It's living so fully inside your own integrity that other people's opinions simply lose their grip on you. I hadn't won because I had more money than anyone expected. I'd won because I no longer needed anyone's approval to feel whole. The truth was, I could still help my family if I chose to. I could offer support, guidance, opportunities. None of my boundaries required cruelty or walking away entirely. But help, I'd learned, only means anything when it comes paired with respect. Without that, it just becomes another way of erasing yourself. For now, I chose distance, not permanent, not punishing, just enough to protect everything I'd built, both the parts people could see and the parts they couldn't. Late that night, Isabel sent another message, shorter than the others, stripped of explanation. "I'm trying to understand. I know it might take time." I read it twice, then set the phone down. Understanding isn't a destination. It's a process, and it doesn't need my constant involvement to keep moving. As I got ready for bed, a deep calm settled over me. Not the calm of everything being resolved, but the calm of knowing I wasn't obligated to resolve it all myself. I'd chosen what not to do. I'd chosen not to punish, not to expose, not to humiliate in return. Not because I couldn't, but because I no longer needed to. That choice felt more powerful than almost anything else I'd done. Sometimes, the loudest statement you can make is silence, paired with a life that speaks for itself. The last real conversation I had with my family didn't happen around a table or over the phone. It happened quietly, weeks later, in the space where absence tends to speak louder than words ever could. Life kept moving, efficient and indifferent. The world didn't pause for revelations or hurt feelings. Contracts still needed signatures, properties still needed oversight. Guests kept arriving with expectations and leaving with memories. My days settled back into their familiar rhythm, steady, deeply mine. What changed wasn't the schedule, it was my posture toward the past. I stopped checking my phone with a tight chest. I stopped wondering how my silence might be interpreted, or whether my words would be twisted into something they weren't. I let messages arrive and sit until I felt ready, and slowly, something shifted in the people reaching out. Isabel stopped apologizing and started asking real questions instead. Not about money, not about success, but about what it had actually been like to leave home at 19 and never look back. Whether it had been lonely, I answered some of those questions. Not all of them, not yet. My parents, for the first time, stopped asking for reassurance. They stopped asking when things would go back to normal. Instead, they asked what I actually needed. That was new. I told them the truth. Time, space, and the willingness to sit with the discomfort of realizing they hadn't known me nearly as well as they'd assumed. Not as punishment, just so the lesson had room to settle. They didn't argue. As for Grant, I never spoke to him again. Not out of avoidance, but because there was simply nothing left to say. He learned what he needed to learn without any involvement from me. His own fear did the teaching I never had to deliver. I heard, through quiet channels, that he'd grown more careful at work, more deliberate with his words, slower to make assumptions about people before knowing anything about them. Whether that change came from real growth or lingering fear, I honestly couldn't say, and it stopped mattering to me either way. The consequence had already landed. Months later, I stood alone on the balcony of one of my properties, watching the sun sink behind the hills, the building humming quietly behind me, full of people enjoying a space they'd probably never think twice about. I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed over the years. The girl who stayed quiet because it was simply easier, the young woman who left because staying would have meant slowly disappearing, the builder who worked in silence because explaining herself had always felt pointless, the woman at that engagement party who stood perfectly still while everyone else laughed. All of them had led here. I used to think revenge was about restoring some kind of balance, taking back what had been taken. Standing there, I understood something more important. Nothing had actually been taken from me. Not my dignity, not my worth, not my future. Those things had been intact the entire time. People simply hadn't noticed. The night of that engagement party will probably always be remembered by my family as the moment everything changed, the moment they realized the quiet one had been powerful all along. For me, it was only confirmation. I'd already built a life that didn't depend on their approval. I'd already learned how to walk into a room without asking permission to be there. I'd already understood that being underestimated, strange as it sounds, can be its own kind of freedom, as long as you know exactly who you are underneath it. The real transformation never happened the night they finally saw me differently. It happened the moment I stopped needing them to. There's a particular kind of peace in that. One that doesn't need applause, doesn't need recognition, one that lets you set a boundary without anger and walk away without guilt. I never cut my family off completely. I never burned anything down. I simply stopped crossing oceans for people who wouldn't cross a single street for me, and in doing that, I found something better than revenge. I found self-respect that didn't waver when the room got loud or the opinions turned cruel. I found clarity that held up under scrutiny. I found the quiet confidence of knowing exactly what I bring into a room, whether anyone chooses to acknowledge it or not. If there's one thing this whole year taught me, it's that people rarely show you who they really are when things are comfortable. They show you when they believe there won't be any consequences. And the most powerful response isn't always exposure. Sometimes it's simply letting them sit with the echo of their own words. To anyone listening who's ever been mocked, overlooked, or written off because you didn't fit someone else's idea of success, you don't owe the world an explanation for your growth. You don't owe anyone a big reveal. Build quietly, stand firmly, and when the truth finally surfaces on its own, let it speak for itself. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, I'd love to hear about it. Share your own experience in the comments, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing for more stories about strength, boundaries, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to raise its voice. And if you're still with me, stay a little longer, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones where dignity wins without ever needing to shout.